So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us for today's session, which I hope will be a really interesting one. We've got delegates from across higher education, from government and enterprise, so I think it will be a very interesting session for you all. My name is Orla Feely. I'm Vice President for Research, Innovation and Impact at UCD, and I'm going to be your MC today. So the topic we're going to be talking about is grand challenges for Irish research. We're hearing a lot about grand challenges, and we want to flesh out a little bit more about what this might mean. Is it something quite different? Is it a repackaging of something we're already doing? What would we need to do grand challenge research well in Ireland, and how might it make a difference? So these are the kind of topics that I'm going to be teasing out through our excellent keynote speech and then a wonderful panel. So just a small bit of housekeeping. First of all, we have closed captioning available today, and you can alter the size of the captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of the screen. So I'll introduce our panelists shortly, but for now I'll ask them just to turn off their videos and mute themselves while we have, first of all, a few opening comments from Professor CiaránÓ hÓgartaigh, who's the President of NUI Galway and also Chair of the IUA. Ciarán, over to you.
Thank you very much, Orla. I think this is particularly apt or an opportune in the sense of a coalescing of interest and research. I think more and more we're finding that research, first of all, is a coalition of interest, but secondly, in the context of grand challenges in particular, is one where I think we're finding more and more, first of all, that we're looking for research which is not solutions in search of a problem, but starting with issues and challenges to be addressed for society and more broadly, and working back from there. And when we do that, I think we find that this also needs the participation, the input, the leadership of more than one discipline, and that very often, as we know in research and as in life, solutions and challenges have their answers in more than one discipline. So that interdisciplinary perspective, that transdisciplinary perspective is particularly important. So delighted to be here today. I think we have a coalition of interests here of civil society, of funders, of the European and international context. And not only do we find that grand challenges need answers and approaches from different disciplines, but I think more and more we'll find investment in research and investment in universities in response to those challenges is from a wide coalition of interests. So, for example, today we have the Health Research Board, we have Science Foundation Ireland, we have the European Commission, and I think more and more we're finding that that investment in research is not just in education, but as an investment from a broad variety of perspectives, whether it be in health, in environmental perspectives, from cultural organizations. And more we're finding that investment in education and therefore in third level and in research is from a broad variety of perspectives. And I'm particularly pleased to see today that broad perspective connecting together to look at this issue of grand challenges. And then finally, I think particularly pleasing today on behalf of the Irish University Association that this is a coalition of institutions as well. So pleased to see Orla Feely, my former colleague at UCD, Rebecca Brown, my current colleague at NUI Galway on the panel, and welcoming John Bell, Mairead O'Driscoll, Kevin O'Sullivan and Ruth Freeman, representing that broader perspective as well, and real expertise in this area. And looking forward to an interesting webinar. And on behalf of the IUA, tá fáilte ó bhillig, tá tréaslaím libh as suchtan obair tar siúla guibh. And I think we're bringing together a great panel of speakers to address these issues and to bring our perspectives forward in this very important area for us, for society, and research for society in particular, I think will be part of our agenda today. So gymí maithagibh, tá mé na hosa bheith libh agus tréaslaím libh agus the Galway Orla nach meic le fáil súsach aniu agus agviniu. So I pass back now to Orla for the main business of the day. You didn't come here to listen to me necessarily, but to others. So I'll pass over to those others. Gymí maithagibh. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ciarán. I think that sets us up very well and sets us a challenge to give that broad perspective. As you say, we have a great panel and a great keynote speaker. So without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. John Bell. John is an alumnus of UCD and of Oxford University, and he's Director of Healthy Planet at the DG Research and Innovation at the European Commission, where he's responsible for leading the research and innovation transitions on climate change. So just about as important a job as you can get. His previous European Commission roles include Director of Bioeconomy and Chef de Cabinet for Research and Innovation under Morgan and Quinn, where he was responsible for delivering Horizon 2020. And John, those of you who know him will know that he's a wonderful champion and an evangelist for, well, for research in general, but particularly for the bioeconomy, for the circular economy, and for the healthy planet. So John, we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Go to Margaret or Orlog, go to Margaret Ciarán. So I'm assuming if I'm speaking to an audience here, I can speak very quickly. I'm going to address three main questions, but before I do, I assume we understand we're in the middle of the gravest crisis that civilization has had its knowledge of, in terms of we are off track in terms of our climate change targets of 1.5 degrees. We're seeing a biodiversity collapse. Our natural world is struggling from pollution and depletion, and we're actually moving into a phase where the impact of human change means that climate adaptation will require us to rethink most of our assumptions about most of our life support systems. But apart from that, it's quite good news. So I'd like to start by talking about what I mean by grand challenges. Orla will come back to this later. Grand challenges are no longer large interdisciplinary areas, which is interesting for research innovation to work in. They are, as Ciarán said at the beginning, they are demand-led situations now where we have a number of systemic changes, transitions that need to be made in the major support systems of our economy and our society that need to be made quickly and need to be made inclusively. I'm going to look at three ways of looking at this question. One is from where I'm sitting now at the European level. How is Europe addressing these grand challenges? And secondly, what is the role of research, innovation, science, universities and the whole community in this transition? And thirdly, coming back to home, back to Ireland and the island, how is this future of our island to be addressed and enabled and created by the response of the research innovation community? So the European Union, which is a slightly improbable success for humanity in this part of the world, was founded by a man called Jean Monnet, and his idea after the experiences of the wars was that if you're faced with an impossible choice and insoluble problems, we need to change the context. The context for us at the moment is clear. The question is, how do we address changing a context? So the European Union has proposed something you'll have heard about called the Green Deal. You'll have it described as a kind of an array of policies, but in effect, it's the European Union's fifth mission after peace from coal and steel, building the single market, ensuring there's food enough for all, enabling the peaceful reconstitution of the continent and the economic creation of the Eurozone. The Green Deal, the creation of the first sustainable carbon neutral continent working within planetary boundaries through a just and fair transition, is what the European Union is for. It means, of course, that in law, it has to be climate neutral, that everything that we do now has to be directed towards achieving a climate neutral continent by 2050, and at least 55 degrees from 1990 level by the end of the decade. It means in practice that every single one of our pieces of policy, of investment, of research are directed towards that change by the end of the decade. We need systemic changes in biodiversity, food, energy, mobility, land use, pollution, our oceans, carbon sequestration, nature restoration, and we need to generate change in a way that brings people who are struggling with this change and disconnected from this change into a more resilient future using the wall of investment that is there. So that's what it is. What does it mean? And in essence, for me, my conclusion is that the European Green Deal it's until 2050. It's beyond political and investment cycles. It's an existential change for the European Union. It means that the European Union's main purpose for the next 30 years is to make peace with nature. This is the nature of the European Union's next task, and it needs to do so by mobilizing systemic transition by design and using all the instruments that are there. And it's doing so against a framework, a race against time, if you like, where we must do this. And this is where the research and innovation role will come in. We're looking at a reconciliation of the biosphere with the economy and society. We need to be moving from a carbon economy to a bio economy. So when Heaney said that we could talk about death of a naturalist, I'm afraid he was a little early. We're all naturalists now. Second issue is, what is the role of research and innovation in all of this? We're the first civilization because of science, research, innovation, because of people like you who actually understand our dilemma, who are starting to really understand the systems, who can see what the innovations and solutions are and what the choices are. And we're also seeing that the only way we can shift is by systemic changes. It won't be small tweaks here or there. We need to change the food system, the energy system, the mobility system, and so forth. And we need to do it quickly. And in this situation, research and innovation has a privileged role, a privileged responsibility. It's a little bit like sitting there after the earthquake in Portugal in 1701 and seeing the whole pathway from the Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution. It has a responsibility, you have a responsibility, we have a responsibility, because we need to set direction. We need to de-risk, demonstrate, deploy, and scale up the kind of solutions that will allow us to adapt, mitigate, and live in a connected and democratically fair society. Secondly, we need to socialize the transition. And I want to come back at some point on the social sciences and the unique insight that Ireland has in how to involve citizens in complex decision-making. And we need to build trust with society. And there, I think the university community have a unique role to play, a bit like the old Celtic towers, not as places of protection, but as lighthouses of knowledge. In Europe, this has meant that we've organized Horizon Europe, building on the success of Horizon 2020, where, by the way, the last call of 2020 was very successful in Ireland, with Cork, Galway, Waterford, and UCD all being successful in the Green Deal call, €1 billion to set these dynamic changes linked to the priorities of the Green Deal. We need to have a new approach, so that the €95 billion, the 1/3 of the funding, the setting out of the new organizational blocks of fundamental research at one end, Innovation Council at the other end, where Mark Ferguson has done an extraordinary job at European Union level, and in the middle, these big clusters where we have to drive these transitions. This is what Horizon Europe will be doing, and part of its unique change is to go for a mission-based approach. We can maybe come back to this later. We need mission thinking, a little bit like how people decided to go back to the moon and back in the 60s. We now need to see how we can get to the next version of our own planet, Earth, an Earth shot rather than a moon shot, in some of these critical systems changes. So we have 4 that are directly relevant for the Green Deal and 1 on cancer, and in which we have outstanding contributions from Irish members of the boards like Peter Heffernan and Kevin O'Connor. The transformation of the ocean and water systems in the sea basins of Europe, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Baltic Sea, the Danube, and the Black Sea, by 2030, the restoration of nature at a scale we haven't seen, the creation of blue parks, the restoration of marine protected areas, the cleaning up of plastic pollution, and so forth. The adaptation mission, the climate adaptation mission. And climate adaptation is a big space for research and innovation in Ireland in particular to step in. We want every region of Europe to be ready for the inescapable changes that are coming, whether you talk about the sea level rise we saw in the Irish Times the other day about Dublin, or forest fires, or health problems, or infrastructures, or ecosystems collapses. And there we're asking, where are the Irish regions and the Irish organizations in stepping up to lead in this area? And we look at climate neutral cities, 100 of them by the end of the decade. Again, we'll see whether there are Irish actors who want to step into that. And soil restoration, the skin of the earth, restoring the soil, 75% of the soil across the European Union through 100 lighthouses, where I know Teagasc and Science Foundation Ireland are very active. So big systemic changes, inspirational. The main issue here is that research innovation is to draw in the people who can make this happen, scale it up, and to work from the beginning with citizens at the beginning. We've seen it COVID. You don't involve the public and the citizens from the beginning, things don't get to where they need to get to. So we're going to go for a mission-based approach in a large part of the really systemic challenges that are there within the Horizon Europe context. And we're going to need, of course, to harness the power of digital and data transitions in doing so. On the ocean side, we'll be developing a digital twin of the ocean as one of the earlier priorities. And in all of this, the social sciences will have to be hardwired. When we look at examples of where Ireland could be positioning itself in this kind of systemic changes or grand challenges, I think you can see in an area like the bioeconomy and natural capital, where Ireland is and has been a leader. Here again, we're talking about the reconciliation of the biosphere and the economy, from shifting from carbon-based to a bio-based economy, and working within natural capital and moving from natural capital to natural capitalism. There's a Nobel Prize in there for some economists, if somebody would like to step up. Working in terms of ensuring that we have the right kind of use of biological resources and the trade-offs that are there: land and sea, crops, forestry, fishery, animals, microorganisms, waste, and looking at them in a systemic way in which we can actually use the value and maintain what we need to do without putting unnecessary pressure on the resources. And Ireland, of course, is led through the National Bioeconomy Plan, the National Bioeconomy Forum. There's a brilliant project by SFI in Teagasc in Cork, which I think still counts as Ireland. My mother's from Cork, I'm allowed to say that. On the zero emissions dairy farm in Cork. I think this, which will be part of a lighthouse initiative, 5,000 farms, is the kind of way in which we can move from breakthroughs onto scalable systemic changes. There are many, many aspects of the bioeconomy framing that will become, I think, larger. But I think one of the areas is this issue around how can rural areas prosper and develop in a way in which they are not simply tenants in a wider broken economic model, but real actors in terms of sustainable communities and value chains that are coming out of the work they do as stewards of the natural economy. And on natural capital, complex issue, a lot of work needs to be done, but it's where we're going as a next economy. In terms of placing the price and value on things and dealing with the risk incentives that are there, and whether we're talking about the value of ecosystem services, the value of actually avoiding climate change through sequestration, the value in terms of pollination and carbon, waste and air health. There's a whole range of issues. But the next way of measuring things will be very different to the way in which the current model is working. And of course, there's the restitution and the regeneration of natural capital. Here I will just mention that Ireland has an extraordinary opportunity in terms of very sensitive areas, our peatlands and bogs, to really look again at how this could be the centre of both a transition in terms of carbon and biodiversity, an enormous driver of prosperity in a new and sustainable way. I think Bord na Móin are doing really interesting things there. And last but not least, there are areas like the renovation wave that the European Union is pushing, 35 million new retrofitted homes. The housing issue in Ireland, of course, has become central. We should use this transition as a way of imagining what it could look like in terms of our homes and our cities, our planning, not simply to retrofit and get them ready for what is coming, but also to follow the example of people like the Grafton architects who won the Pritzker Prize last year, Yvonne Farrell and Sherry McNamara. This is the Nobel Prize of Architecture. Design, the quality of what we do, making what is best available to everybody. There's a new initiative called the EU Bauhaus Initiative, where this is at the heart of things. Sustainable design for our public buildings, for social housing, inclusive housing, accessible housing, but quality and beauty at the heart of what we do. And last but not least, climate adaptation and resilience, which is actually probably the most difficult issue to talk about at the moment, because it has so many different aspects. But the question is, who is actually preparing for a climate resilient island here across all the different risks that we face in terms of disruptions to our food systems, our water systems, our weather systems, our ocean systems, our housing systems, our health systems, our infrastructures, and our energy systems. And if you compare a city like Dublin to what's happening in other parts of the European Union, where they're ready for the city as a sponge and so forth, it'll be interesting to see how cities and regions in Ireland can engage, for example, in the climate adaptation mission, to be leaders in how these changes can take place. So last but not least, the question of the future of Ireland, which is a big subject in terms of the grand challenges. And here maybe, as a local, may I just maybe say that I hear a lot of talk on the future of the island, very little of which actually addresses the island as an island. Ireland's future will be, I think, more determined by its geography than its history in the next decade and in the decades to come. And this is going to require a bit of a shift in the way in which we think about some of the problems that we have to solve, and a shift in the way research and innovation is going to have to move. What is happening, because we are a temperate zone in a particular place, in a particularly changing climate, with systemic changes coming from the ocean, may mean, on the one hand, that Ireland is in a very fortunate place in terms of what it is able to do to produce food, for example, and energy. It's an ocean superpower in terms of the possibilities of new medicines and microbiome-based achievements in terms of the restitution of nature and so forth. But we will be facing aspects of change which cannot be talked away or ignored. So we are going to have patterns of weather which our farming and food system need to be ready for. There's a great piece of work done recently by Tom Arnold trying to look at a modest proposal and looking at this on an island basis. The island, leaving aside the politics and all the rest of it, the island is a geographical, facing the same geographical challenges. And we need to be ready, resilience for weather, for our food system, for our bioeconomy. We need to look at our ocean wealth. We don't think enough in Ireland, the fact that we are actually an island and facing out into a world. The work that's been done by the National Marine Institute on the All Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance and the Galway Declaration is extraordinary. We now have 1,000 research teams from Europe working in the North Atlantic, and we're signing off a new agreement with Joe Biden next year to do a whole Atlantic pole-to-pole inspired by the work launched in Galway a few years ago. Our carbon potential, you can go through the list. There's a whole series of issues, and we need to have an understanding of what is going to happen where we actually live and work, and research and innovation has to step in. So there the question is, what is our ambition to be? And research and innovation has to work not in this usual way. I mean, you work very well in collaboration, and of course you're all in competition for funding, but here I think across the island, the research and innovation resources need to be mobilized to engage with some of the critical issues that will affect the lives and well-being of all kinds of people in all parts of the island. And I see there are initiatives like Minister Harris's recent initiative to do so on infectious diseases is a great idea. Tom Arnold talking again about the food system, which are all integrated in terms of the way in which weather and environment and biodiversity and the boundaries of the planet impose themselves. In all of this, the universities, whatever kind of university or third level institution we're talking about, are going to play an incredibly important role. There's very little trust in society, and you are going to have to get out there and be beacons of communication and translate what is happening here into the vernacular language of citizens who feel frightened and disconnected and are worried about the price of what is coming and the impact it will have on them. So research innovation has to really be an enabler, and we need the mission-oriented approach, I think, which is set out in the consultation paper on the National Research Innovation Strategy, which is out there at the moment. And universities will be addressed in a new communication from the Commission in the course of the next year. So maybe to finish, I know I've referred to Heaney already. Maybe Joyce is wrong when he said that history alone was the nightmare from which we're trying to awake. Geography is starting to make itself present as well. Science and research and innovation at this point, at this particular point where we have these choices, must give courage to politics. It must give hope to citizens. It must give inspiration to entrepreneurs, and it must give respite to nature. We need to step up and step forward as a research and innovation community in this decisive decade. My last comment would be, if we look at what I started off with, that the European Union's basic task is putting at a very broad level is to make peace with nature. I wondered, in looking at the great achievements on this island, whether that could be the next peace process on this island for research and innovation to work together to deal with the challenges facing the whole island, whoever anybody is and where they come from, whatever their jurisdiction is, to make peace with nature. This could be the next peace process on the island to deal with the extraordinary knowledge that is here from all of the universities, from all of the institutions, from practitioners and rural communities, and the people who need to make it happen. Maybe to work to become the island that can be the green heart of the Green Deal, and the one which will show how we can move forward in reconciling our biosphere and our economy, in making peace with nature, and in actually describing and envisaging that better is possible next. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And my first ask is going to be for our IUA colleagues to capture some of those wonderful things that you said there, particularly when you exhorted us at the end to give, what was it, hope to the population, to give courage to politicians, and so on. You expressed so eloquently and so inspirationally what it is we're about in research and what it is in particular that we have to be about at this really, really crucial time. So you threw out lots of thoughts there that we're going to pick up now with the panel. Obviously, the whole issue of climate change and its implications, grand challenges more broadly, which of course will particularly address the areas you described, but also reaching into other domains, the question of the social sciences and their particular role, the whole shared island view of research, which we are increasingly aware of in this country, and communication, how we communicate with the population, how we inform, how we inspire, how we advocate. So thank you so much for doing exactly what we needed of you, which is to throw out all these wonderful ideas. We'll throw it open now to the panel just before I introduce the panel members. For those who are here, you have the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please give your questions and answers. We have about another 35 minutes now, so I'll start off by putting some questions to our distinguished panelists, but please do share your own questions and answers, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So the panel members then will be known to many of you. We've Dr. Ruth Freeman, who's Director of Science for Society at Science Foundation Ireland. Kevin O'Sullivan, who's Environment and Science Editor at the Irish Times. Professor Rebecca Braun, who's Executive Dean, the College of Arts, Social Sciences and Celtic Studies at NUI Galway, and Dr. Mairead O'Driscoll, who's CEO of the Health Research Board, and John will also be staying with us. So John, maybe I'll start with you, and you did touch on this, but I might ask you to flesh it out a little bit more. So these missions at the European level, particularly those in this huge area that you outlined, which is the biggest challenge facing humanity. So every country in the world and every sort of transnational system in the world is going to be looking to deliver research success with some kind of mission-based approach to these challenges. What can a small country like Ireland do, and how will we be most effective in doing what we set out to do, in allowing our grand challenges at a national level to fit into the broader mission-based approach that you describe at Europe and similar in other countries?
Well, I'll break it down into a couple of things. So the first thing is, I think the missions have just been adopted, and there's a whole Horizon Europe machinery there which people can apply for in the usual way, and they should look at that and read the implementation plans and so forth. That's a very practical way of doing it. I think we also need to bring some of the mission leaders. I'm working with Pascal Lamy and Connie Hedigo and Kees Veerman and others in these mission boards. There are distinguished Irish people in the mission boards. I think we need to bring the mission board people to Ireland at some point and engage. Now, if we look at some of the missions I'm most involved in, the mission on restoring the oceans and water systems is going to be operating in sea basins. So in the Atlantic and Arctic Sea Basin, Ireland has played a huge role and is playing a leading role in the world on structuring mission type grand challenge marine and ocean research and innovation. The Galway process I mentioned at the beginning, signed off by Mairead and Quinn, has turned into this huge process where there's huge cooperation going on. There'll be major initiatives taking place within that, and they will turn into programs and so forth. So one of the things is that Ireland PLC needs to engage with the ocean mission, say we want to be an active leader in the Atlantic and Arctic Sea Basin. And that wouldn't be too difficult to organize because we need to have leaders. Portugal and Ireland have been working quite closely in the past, so to work out of that space. There's also enabling initiatives. I mentioned we're going to do a digital twin of the ocean as part of the Destination Earth initiative, which basically means all of the different systemic ways we have of understanding what's going on in the ocean, from the Copernicus space system to the EMODNet fisheries system to the in-situ observation of the marine institutes, the modeling that's going on, the predictive AI stuff that's going on. We're going to try and connect all those things so we have a deeper real-time understanding and access to understanding what the ocean is actually doing, more predictive capacity in terms of the impact, in terms of weather, in terms of what's going on in the biogeochemistry of the ecosystems and so forth. So for the people like those in Waterford who've been very successful in high performance computing and digital, you know, there'll be areas like that. So that's the ocean mission. I'm not going to go into them all, you'll be glad to hear in the same detail. The soils, I think what SFI and Teagasc are doing on the lighthouses, they need to engage with the lighthouses. They want 100 lighthouses on, if you like, healthy, sustainable practices on the soil dealing with all the issues that everybody knows about there. And I think the big one for me, and I think it's the big policy space that is going to be most difficult, because we're driving hard at getting the climate mitigation, decarbonisation done. People are slightly taking their eye off the ball on climate adaptation. There will be a new report from the IPCC and the COP on climate adaptation next year. It's coming at us quickly. It's happening already. It has very significant impacts on all aspects of the economy. And it is going to require every region, every city to have an actual resilience plan where they know what the risks are and they start to make the investments that are necessary. We can go into it in some other detail as new European Union strategy. The mission is going to start off with a number of pilot regions of places that want to be at the forefront of this. So either Ireland, which is in, I think in NUTS terminology, is 2 regions, or cities in Ireland want to be part of this. They should come and work with us and say, we want to be part of this. Because I think climate adaptation, as we've seen, is going to be a huge challenge in terms of most of our assumptions about most of our systems. So, you know, whether there will be demonstrator projects, so whether you want to work on having too much or too little water, and they're going to be done at scale. The amounts of money will start big and will become huge, because the idea is to leverage things that can then be done in similar regions. If you're dealing with forest fires or floods, or you're dealing with your main infrastructure being knocked out, or you're dealing with sea level rise, or you're dealing with the collapse of your ecosystems that are necessary. This is a new space in which we can start working together on that. And I think that's an area where there's a lot of expertise in Ireland would be a great offer. I'll stop there, but obviously on cancer, there's a mission on cancer going on. There's a huge a community of practice in Ireland of that already. And the climate neutral cities is obvious. You know, the actors in Ireland who are active in the Covenant of Mayors, I presume, are going to step up there. I mean, this is my main message, is I think Ireland is uniquely placed. It wasn't 25 years ago. It's a great achievement in Ireland. There was no science base when I left Ireland in the late 80s. It's a great achievement. Things that you all take for granted. We're now in a privileged position, I think, to really do something for ourselves and for everybody else that's there. And I think we should step forward, and also our global responsibility to other small island nations around the world who may just need this.
Great. That sets me up perfectly now to bring in Ruth from Science Foundation Ireland. So Ruth, as we seek in Ireland in our new research and innovation strategy to figure out what's the next story for Irish research, part of that is likely to be grand challenges. So what do we mean from an Irish perspective by grand? How grand is grand in this context? And you know, what are we thinking of, and what's shaping up, and where do you see the real potential for Ireland, looking kind of from the inside out, as opposed to John's perspective of looking back into the country?
Thanks, Orla, and yeah, thanks, John, for those really, really inspiring words. It was such an interesting talk, and quite frankly, I wouldn't disagree. I think, you know, we in Ireland, we've always been quite outward looking, and I think for us, you know, again, I think John articulated very nicely what we mean by grand challenges. You know, they do go beyond these ordinary research questions and priorities. You know, they need to be things that are, you know, demand led and genuinely difficult to achieve, but with some hope of being tractable. So I think that's the kind of ambition where we want to be. But we want that ambition here in Ireland to be potentially global in scale. You know, we want to fund challenge projects that have the potential to have that impact. And I think, as John said, that track record of finding demonstrators where, you know, I think we need to think about strengths, we need to think about opportunities, and we need to think about challenges, you know, that we all have. And John's already articulated many of those here. But there are probably others that we haven't even truly thought about yet. I mean, if we think about the transformation of the entire food system, you know, we obviously have been funding projects looking at agriculture and soil, but, you know, think about all of that expertise that we have around, you know, the microbiome and, you know, fermentation here. You know, do we need to think about future proteins and how we become a leader there? You know, do we need to think about our genetics community and how we're going to adapt our crops to be better able to bind carbon and survive in either flooded fields or drought? So I think we need to get broad, and I think we need to think beyond our disciplines and actually about getting a community of people into rooms who want to solve particular problems. And, you know, that's kind of been our philosophy so far in the Future Innovator Prize. So, you know, I think we need to think big and we need to think about solving these problems, but building on our strengths and the opportunities that we have here. But you know, like the Farm Zero C project, how can those projects be lighthouses? So let's do them for us, but let's do them for everyone as well. And you know, maybe I would also just echo that piece around bringing the public along, because you know that has been a fundamental part. And if you look at any challenge kind of prize or program everywhere, capturing the public's imagination and bringing the public with you is absolutely critical. And of course, all the stakeholders that might be the ones where fear will come in about change. So I think it's about doing that in a really, really intentional way as part of these projects. So, you know, our program that we're running this, you know, on behalf of the department, Creating Our Future, and going out to the public, you know, over these months to talk to them about where they see those opportunities, even if they don't come from a research background. Those will also feed into our plans around challenges for the future.
Thanks very much, Ruth. And just to remind people that they can still submit their ideas to Creating Our Future on your website. And I'll probably return to that in a couple of minutes, that question of public engagement, because it is so important. Next, I'll turn though to Kevin. Kevin, you're just back, of course, from COP26. So much of what you heard from John there will have resonated very much with you, I expect. What is your sense, your takeaways from COP26 and looking at it in an Irish perspective, where you think we currently reside in terms of our research around the environment, around climate change, and where you think the opportunities are?
Thanks very much, Orla. Yes, I'm back from Glasgow, a little bit battle weary, but I think on broadly it was a good outcome, even though there was huge expectation. But there was a very significant element in the final Glasgow Climate Pact related to science and the use of best available science. Now, people might think that's just a very obvious and simple commitment, but it puts everything on a different plane, in my view. So essentially, it means that countries can no longer commit to vague promises and, you know, voluntary undertakings that have marked the Paris since 2015. And say, oh, we're trying to get to below 2 degrees and hopefully we will, and we're doing everything we can. So the science is now saying very clearly, as John has flagged, that we have to get on track to limit global warming this century to 1.5 degrees. Within that framework, halving emissions essentially by 2030, and then maintaining action to achieve net zero by 2050. So the current reality is that most IPCC modeling suggests that you know, these very scenarios that are, most of them are saying we're going to exceed 1.5 degrees within 20 years. So you can see the scale of the task that faces the world. Now, the really interesting thing about the COP was that there was various analyses produced during the first weeks. We're getting down below 2 degrees, but the carbon action track modeling process factored in all the promises up to COP22 and after COP22 and said, no, actually, we're facing a 2.4 degree world. So that means there's an emissions gap there, and the temperature rise is inevitable in that scenario. So we're in a scenario where we're approaching a near unlivable planet in less than 50 years, which is remarkably stark. So that underlines what John said earlier. This is the task that the world, you know, overriding everything else, and it has to be done in tandem with addressing the biodiversity crisis. So that's the backdrop where I think science has to come in, and I think that focus, you know, mindset shift in focus, I should say, as happened with COVID-19, but it has to be multiplied by 100 and more, because of what's unfolding. And that's why I think last week's announcement of the new All Ireland Climate and Biodiversity Research Network is so significant. And that, as many people tuning in today will be aware, is a new way of adopting all island thinking to these big challenges that already have been outlined, particularly in relation to climate and biodiversity. And I can reassure John, it is very much a disciplinary way. a multi-institute approach. And, you know, the obvious backbone of it is sustained collaboration. But I think the really critical requirement would be sustained funding to retain top quality researchers in that framework. And if anyone has had a chance to look at its first outline document, there's some really good analysis on the big challenges within that. And they cross over with what the speakers have already highlighted in terms of mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity, and a just transition. So you can see this network is aiming high, and but you can see also broadening it out how the challenge is going to be immense, because the failure to deliver on climate commitments is appalling, but it also means that more radical action will be needed post 2050, in my view. So in other words, as highlighted by the IPCC, you're going to have to remove carbon from the atmosphere. It's very expensive, but a huge challenge. We don't know how to do that. So there's a huge technological gap there that needs to be bridged. But that's essentially how COP is thinking in terms of the future and in terms of the science requirement that will be required to fill in both the emissions gap and the technological gap.
Thanks very much, Kevin. And again, a few more things that I'll probably pick up as we go forward with questions. I'll turn now to Rebecca. And Rebecca, John mentioned the particular role of the social sciences, and it's come up in the questions. And again, just to remind participants to put their questions there in the Q&A, the humanities as well, of course, as the social sciences. Where do the humanities and social sciences fit into grand challenge research?
Absolutely bang in the middle, I would say. I mean, everything that we've been hearing there has just really emphasized these grand challenges are a whole society problem, and they require a whole society solution. And in university terms, when you're thinking about the different disciplines, you need all of the expertise that you can muster if you're trying to come up with solutions that will actually work and will actually inspire people. I loved the way John finished with his values kind of reflections that we'll need. Some way science needs to give courage to politicians, it needs to give hope to citizens, entrepreneurship to the entrepreneurs, and respite to nature. So science is obviously excellent at identifying the problems. It's in the natural world, it's excellent at coming up with technological solutions, but it needs help on the values piece and understanding how people tick, how things will go down, what kind of cultural contexts, you know, are going to be receiving that. So because the danger is that people just get totally disenfranchised, you know, downtrodden, depressed, turn off and look away from the problems. So I think in a way the question then becomes, if we all agree, well, we need all of the different disciplines, how can you go about doing it? How can you go about making sure you've really got, you know, the talent from different researchers mobilized in these projects? And I've just come back to the Irish higher education context from the UK, which has in more recent times really been trying to crack the how do you do interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research, and how do you make sure that you really are getting the best from all of the different disciplines. And I thought it might be interesting, given the way the conversation has gone, to share an example of a recent funding call, because it just opens out the question of modalities and how do you really motivate people to feel that they can contribute. So UKRI, which has now become the umbrella for the funding boards in the UK, has all of the different disciplines represented through the sub panels, if you like. And they recently had a call called the Future of UK Treescapes, which was looking specifically at, you know, so science knows that UK needs to plant a whole load of more trees if it's going to stand a chance of meeting its carbon targets. And they sort of said, but, you know, science kind of knows where to put them, but we have a problem in as much as people won't be very happy about it. Or, you know, it will run into other problems with, you know, kind of contested land use. So they set up a call and they said, you absolutely have to have representation from the ESRC, the AHRC and NERC, so the Environmental Funding Board, the Arts and Humanities Funding Board, and Economics and Social Sciences. And they set the parameters like that. But what I was really impressed by was then they put a huge amount of effort into making the academics believe that they meant it. So they appointed program ambassadors, they ran webinars, they had specific webinars targeted at the arts and humanities researchers, at the environmental scientists, and at the economic and social scientists. And they really built up a momentum of making people believe that they were serious, that the different disciplines were going to have parity of esteem. And I just thought that was a really, really interesting model, because I've seen this happen before. And in fact, a senior colleague commented to me sometime, a few years back, that there'd been a European big, grand challenge, wicked problem, lots of money available on the topic of water. And she said, and we all thought there'd be lots of submissions from the arts and humanities and social sciences because it's such a grand, important topic. And we don't understand why nobody really seemed to apply. And I thought, well, it's probably because people couldn't quite see how they were supposed to get there. They didn't believe they would be taken seriously. So I think that there's some really useful work to be followed there. And just, I guess in closing, I would say, to bring it back to the arts and humanities, these kind of grand challenges, I think, are absolutely where the excitement is in research for all researchers across the university. But it's a huge opportunity for the arts and humanities, who traditionally have not had access to larger pots of money to do to do the kind of work at a level that they might really like to do. There's a huge opportunity here if people can do that work of seeing how they slot in. If the research community can really understand that it's fully wanted, there's a huge potential there for arts and humanities researchers and social sciences to do something quite exciting.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I loved your example there of how the UKRI went around that treescapes project, and it sets up nicely a question that I'd like to put to Mairead now. What would we need to do differently in our national system to really deliver on grand challenge research in terms of our mechanisms, our programs, our structures? Do we need to do something quite new, or will it fit quite readily into existing structures and mechanisms?
Well, thanks, Orla. This is a really interesting discussion. I'm really enjoying it. And I think, as you said, what distinguishes the grand challenge, I suppose, from the more traditional approaches to supporting research, as we just heard actually from a number of speakers now, is that it has to be such a problem and solution focused right from the outset. So you're kind of looking at it from the opposite side, really. You're focusing on solutions, identifying problems, of course. And by definition, grand challenges are thorny and difficult. So you do need to do things differently. And we had a great example there, I think, from Rebecca. And I think Ruth mentioned earlier the phrase, community of innovators. And that's what you need. You need to do it differently, and you need to bring in a much broader community. So I think in terms of mechanisms, really, you need to find ways right up front of involving the end users and the knowledge users. And, we might think, well, we do that, but we don't really. We tend to be quite research focused. But I mean, I think you really do need to build that in right from the beginning, not just in terms of kind of the actual doing of, research or project, but even into the way you identify and describe the challenge and the way you frame that challenge. And that was a good example around the water. It's not just a technological challenge, it's a societal challenge as well, and economic probably, and in terms of the way you set clear criteria and goals. And you have to follow that all the way through. So, it's not just that you involve people at certain points. You actually have to build that team, I suppose, or that community and bring them all the way through. So I suppose you need to move beyond that sort of more traditional sort of academic focused projects to bring in those sectoral perspectives, accepting, of course, that you always have excellent research. But I mean, you need to bring in, for example, policymakers, and even possibly regulation and legislation, because like some of the examples that we've heard cited now today, a lot of them actually, these big grand challenges involve data, use of data, big data. And right now here in Ireland, we're not even set up from a legislative position to exploit or use data in any of these areas. And so we need to bring that in. And trust, again, it was brought up. Building trust has been mentioned. We shouldn't assume that's there at the moment. And that does need to be, it needs to be built, but it also needs to be maintained. So I think whatever we do, we have to design our mechanisms so we align research, policy, the investment, regulation, and as well bring in the public voice. And I suppose what that just points to is the need for better coordination mechanisms, whether you're looking at, broad-based steering groups or project groups that bring in partners who are working on the ground in that sector alongside researchers, and also bring in the public, because we are talking here for the most part about problems that have major societal implications and relevance. And I suppose maybe that's a challenge for us here, because we do tend to be quite individualistic in our approach, whether we're at institution or departmental level, you know, we like to do our own thing. But I mean, we have done it reasonably well, I think, with COVID. You know, as an example, we haven't got it all right, but there's been a genuine attempt to approach it from a cross-sectoral perspective, which isn't straightforward, because we can even see that the interests of health, the interests of the economy in the case of COVID, they're not always clearly aligned, at least in the short term. So I think just another couple of points as well. I mean, we've talked here about, I suppose, the grand challenges around climate. I don't know if there are particular grand challenges for us here in Ireland where we seem to be finding it hard to make progress, or if that's maybe onto local level. But I think it would be interesting just to talk here in the Irish context, to think about what we mean by a global or a national, or I suppose a grand challenge in the national sense. And the other point I'd just like to make, we're thinking again about grand challenges that are, I suppose, from a technological or that are technological or societal. But one of the grandest challenges we have actually in research is actually implementing research. There's a huge implementation gap between the research that gets done, however excellent it is, and then putting that into policy and practice. So I think closing that gap is also a grand challenge that we might want to consider. Thanks.
Thanks, Mairead. Again, with all the speakers, so much that we could follow up on then, and we're so limited, unfortunately, in our time. And again, you alluded to the other types of grand challenges, such as in health areas like cancer, infectious diseases, healthy aging. You know, there's so many other grand challenges out there for us to consider, and for us in Ireland to figure out where we can really make a difference is going to be very, very important. I'll take some of the questions now that are coming in on the Q&A. John, here's one that you might like to take, and it's about the climate challenge moonshot, if you like, and it's saying that planning a moonshot without a NASA seems harder to achieve. Is there a NASA for the climate challenge, and can we coordinate our efforts effectively without one?
Well, I think this room is NASA. I think we have to rethink what we mean. We're not talking about just technology-based challenges. I think one of the things we need to have is our own courage from our own civilization's point of view, that we are in a position where collectively we understand what we're facing and we have some of the means to move forward. And those of us who have the benefit of living in a democratic system, you know, we have a handle on how to make it happen. It may well be that we're going to have to develop, you know, for example, the oceans, they talk about a CERN of the sea, because we have an inner space program we need to develop. Ruth was talking earlier on about the microbiome, again, where Ireland is doing wonderful work in Cork and elsewhere. This is going to be as big as the genome revolution 30 years ago. So how that needs to be supported is another question. And then there's the underpinning digital and high performance computing and that whole AI bit that's going on there. I think we may need different kinds of organizations, but the tendency has always been to create the organization and try and solve the problem. I think if we can draw from the arts and science and the arts and humanities, if we look at the way in which modern Ireland emerged, it emerged really as an act of both will and imagination, that there were people came together and decided, wouldn't it be better, you know, if we had our own theatre, an idea of Ireland that motivated people, and different models of society and the economy, the cooperative movement at the beginning of the century, and all the rest. I don't think we necessarily need. I mean, one could look at Irish Water, for example. I don't think we necessarily have to start with an institution and move forward. But I do agree that you need the European way is to do things in a distributed way, which has got many strengths, and that you get a lot of diversity inbuilt, but we probably need to organize it a bit more. And I'm certainly open to any of the thinking as to how we do that. Okay,
thanks very much, John. Here's quite a different question, and Rebecca, you might be best positioned to answer this one. Is the ask to researchers around these grand challenges, is it compatible with current research culture and the current accepted norms in publications and other metrics, in other words, or is a culture change needed within academia to enable and incentivize researchers to shift focus? And indeed, would that be feasible, and could it be delivered along the kind of timescale we're talking about?
So I suppose that's kind of, in a way, that's asking about the impact end of research and how that gets taken up in promotions, being promoted being one of the main things that does motivate you, I guess, as a researcher to keep going. And as I said, I've only recently joined the Irish context. It seems to me that there is some work to be done around getting better at articulating impacts and rewarding them within university structures. But I do think that that's not a new idea. I think people are working on that. The other thing that I think could maybe be thrown in here is we have a slightly bad habit when we're talking about research to forget about the other bit of what we do at universities, which is, of course, teaching. And another reason why people struggle to really throw themselves into, you know, the grand challenges and the research is because they're really busy teaching. But that shouldn't be a problem. The teaching is a huge positive, because teaching is the one most singularly important thing we do for engaging with future generations and indeed wider society. Government puts a lot of money into teaching. It's one of the main, certainly in the arts and humanities, it's the main income, full stop, that is paying our salaries. It's not quite putting enough in. So there's a slight shortfall. It's not quite paying enough for the students' fees to be, for the cost of teaching them to be covered. If they only put a little bit more in, they would free up the whole 40% of researchers' contracts where they're supposed to be doing research, rather than catching up the shortfall on teaching. So if you're looking for some smart ideas about, you know, how you could put a bit of money in that might go a long way, then just thinking again about how the teaching activities of researchers relate to the research they're doing, I think could be really beneficial. And I suppose the final point on that is, and they have to be 100% interlocked. I think we could be much more innovative in our teaching space if, you know, that all of this grand challenges, when we're talking about framing it as research, that should be informing our programs in really innovative ways. And I think we've got some work to do there.
Thanks, Rebecca. That point about teaching is so important. John, I think last week you described teaching as the motor of transition to the bioeconomy, to a more sustainable world. So it's so important that we always remember that. Mairead, the question has come in about the pandemic, and is there anything that we can learn from the research and societal response to the pandemic that might guide us in how we go about designing research to address these other grand challenges?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, actually. The pandemic was, you know, I hate to say it was a great example, but it was very interesting to see how, you know, first of all, actually, the importance of public trust, I think, in the science was really, really important. So I think just, you know, keeping sight of that. I think that the real hunger there among policymakers for the evidence and for good evidence, and, you know, so and there's a big move at the moment, I think, and I know the RIA have been involved in this, the Academy, you know, in looking at how we can build bridges and, you know, close that gap between the research, the academic community and policymakers. And I think that's really, really important. But, you know, I think it showed, it was very good a very good demonstrator of how complicated things are, and how complicated, you know, what's good in one, or what makes sense in one area, you know, it doesn't make sense in another, you know, so it is complicated. But I think, you know, we made a lot of progress very, very quickly. And I think that's the other thing. It's interesting when the political will is there to do something, how we can really do it. When the political will is there and we pull together, we can actually make progress on some of these difficult things very, very quickly. And I think there's a lesson in that for us.
Thanks, Mairead. Now, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, so I'll go around the panel one last time, and I'll finish with you, John. And maybe I'll put the same question to all of you. You know, and John was so eloquent in describing the prize here, and, you know, what the opportunity is for research. So if you look forward to research in Ireland, say 10 years from now, having gone through a grand challenge type addition to our research landscape, what would be your ambition for, or your vision for what Ireland could have achieved by that time through a grand challenge approach to research within Ireland? So who'd like to kick off on that? And apart from John, who I'll come to at the very end.
Well, I'll come in first then.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I think there's a credibility thing that has to be addressed in the first instance, and that is that we have to apply science to ensure that we are forcing the emissions curve down, and we're not there yet. And I think that will reinforce credibility in terms of other research solutions and show that we're doing it. So I think if that, in the short term, if that could be achieved, I think that'd be a great enabler. And also, I think then we have to focus on something that is going to give an international return. So as John has cited, the peatlands issue, I think, would be a really in terms of, you know, turning this thing around, addressing both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. And then I think the other obvious one, which I'd love to see, and it would build new relationships, and that is finding a way to decarbonize agriculture while sustaining rural communities. I think that would be a huge win. I think the current research base that we have could apply very well to that and bring solutions. And I think then equally they could apply to the rest of the world.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. There, if we achieved any amount of those, we'd be doing pretty well. So thanks very much. Ruth?
Yeah, but I agree. I think we need to be ambitious. And I think in 20 years, hopefully we'll see there's a number of those key areas where Ireland is now playing that leading role, and we're seen to have actually moved the dial on some of these things in a real and impactful way. And I think, you know, to have a public that's been part of that conversation, that it's been a conversation where everyone's been allowed in and everyone's been motivated by actually solving this challenge that's in front of all of us. Like we all have to take part. I mean, as Mairead said, you know, when COVID happened and, you know, she and I would have been working together, you know, there was this great political will to just get things done. But, you know, we are probably going into a marathon, not a sprint now over the next 20 years. So we do need to work together and set up those systems together so we can keep going for that whole marathon. But I think the potential is there. I think what we've seen, you know, the quality of the researchers and the cooperation and the motivation around these issues is there. And I think we just need to foster that and kind of give people the tools to keep going.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Mairead?
Yeah, I think all of those things and would be absolutely fantastic. I think, you know, I think a more confident approach, confidence in ourselves as a country and as a nation scientifically and from a research point of view that we can solve these problems. I'd like to see a more integrated system. I'd like to see us working, you know, in a more integrated way across the system. And I just think generally more engaged. And I think sort of some, you know, genuine engagement from the public as well would be really, really valuable.
Thanks very much, Mairead. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, really just building on what my colleagues have said before me, and I suppose to emphasize, I think Ireland has, as a country and as a higher education system, it has one huge advantage, which is its small size. That, you know, having tried to work through various forms of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, cross-sector kind of initiatives in the UK context, I just think that there's a real value to not being too big, to being for the relations to be, you know, relatively local. And what I would wish, and I think it's wholly attainable, is that in 10 years' time, we're really starting to model best practice for quite different disciplines to be talking to one another to have figured out how to do it. And it's not easy, and it doesn't get any easier the larger the scale. So I think Ireland might hit the sweet spot if we can just keep that momentum going.
Yeah, and that's something that we've often spoken about our system, and sometimes we actually turn it into reality, that, you know, you're small enough to demonstrate something, but then big enough that you can scale it globally out from Ireland. So lots of commonality there coming from what you've said about, you know, credibility underpinning and providing an evidence base for national efforts, about engagement and integration, about commitment, about confidence. I love that word, that we should be more confident in how we deliver our research. So John, I'll give the last word now to you, whatever words you want to leave ringing in our ears now as we go forward. And again, thanks to all of you, to John and all the panelists, for what I think has been a really interesting, engaging and inspirational lunchtime discussion.
I mean, for me too. I mean, it's there's something very specific about the scale in Ireland that people have talked about. I mean, and we shouldn't underestimate it. It is going to be very, very difficult. One of the things I'd like to see in 10 years' time is we move away from what we have at the moment, where people are being pitted. One group is being pitted against the other as a means for not doing anything. I think one of the great strengths in Ireland, COVID, we've seen it so many times in the past, is this great possibility to mobilize people across societies and beliefs and political parties and all this to get things done. So one of my dreams would be that in 10 years' time, that the transition will have strengthened our democratic system and not weakened it, and that people will see that the transition that research innovation is driving, number one, is building better cities, decent places to live, stronger rural communities, better schools, and so forth, that the transition is actually an act of imagination almost, that it's building a better place. Second thing is, I'd like Ireland to be a place that people come to visit, not simply because of our traditional attributes, but because they want to see, what does the green economy look like? in a place where they've managed to mobilize the resources. And I'll stop there because I think, I mean, what has already been said, Kevin, in particular about at some point we're going to be asked to make that commitment, for example, in the boglands, or how we move the food system forward. And the food system, remember, most of our assumptions about the future are, shall we say, temporary. There will be disruptions to the food system in Europe as well as everywhere else. So fixing some of those things that we're really good at and taking pride in it, and making it that it doesn't, that it stabilizes the lives of everybody on the island would be great. And one last thing is the oceans. In 10 years' time, I'd like Ireland to be one of the 3 leading centres for what you call the inner space race, taking the knowledge in the ocean, being central to that, because we are a leading island nation. And thank you for not mentioning Brexit at any stage in the afternoon.
I nearly did, but we didn't get to it. So you're welcome. Listen, thanks all so much for joining us. I thought it was a really fascinating discussion. So both talking about grand challenges and that particular area, which is, if you like, the grandest of grand challenges, the whole area of climate change, climate adaptation, and all of our response. But of course, there are all the other challenges that some people touched on that you might very well emerge on our landscape as we go forward with the grand challenge approach. So I think exciting times ahead, and we look forward to working with everybody around this. So thanks to the IOA for organising this very important series. Thanks obviously to John, to the panellists, and also to Ciarán for his opening remarks. The Future of Ireland series will continue on the 9th of February next year. We'll be talking to Taoiseach and Minister for Enterprise, Trade and Employment, Leo Varadkar, on the role of universities in shaping the future development of our country and economy. So another really interesting topic there. So thanks again to all of you. Thanks to all who spoke, and we look forward to seeing how this one develops. Slán all, goodbye.